Hello, and welcome to the 27th episode of the Mike McNair Revolutionary Strategy series. Today is Saturday, the 19th of October 2019, and I'm your host, Tom O'Brien. This week we read more of Chapter 8, Political Consciousness, talk about the importance of a functioning international, and go in hard on Lenin's strategic errors. This week I have the new Patreon Benjamin O'Kane to thank. You too can help keep the good ship Alpha afloat by joining the Patreon gang for as little as $5 a month, which works out at $1 an episode. Patrons get special bonus episodes, the right to vote on the reading group series, and other cool stuff too. When we reach 100 patrons, we'll be producing a second Patreon-only podcast every month. As it's the podcast's first anniversary of being on Patreon, all new patrons for the rest of the month of October will get a free exclusive from Alpha to Omega badge. They are seriously lit. The next reading group series is not too far off now, so make sure to get your copy of Marx's The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. Après McNair, Les Brumaires. If you'd like to comment on the show, please do so on the YouTube channel, and make sure to like, subscribe, and share. You can also join me on Facebook or Twitter too. Okay, to the discussion. Okay, do you want to hit this paragraph then, Pouya?
The working class is an international class. It can only attain full political consciousness of its character as a class. Become a class for itself if this class is expressed in international unity of a workers' class movement. The symbolic unity offered by the Second International was less than was needed for the proletariat to take power, but still necessary for the proletariat to get as far as it got in the run-up to 1914. We can see the same phenomenon in the fate of communist and Trotskyist parties/groups after the dissolution of the Comintern. The allegiance of the tankies to the USSR and its leadership was deformed and bastardized internationalism, but it was a form of internationalism nonetheless. The Eurocommunists, as they lost their internationalism, also lost their ability to promote any sort of class politics and became, if anything, more liberal than the Social Democrats.
Like that? That's true.
That is true.
That's very true.
Is it the internationalism that's, you know what I mean? Like, you could say that, like, internationalism and class politics and everything, you know, they disappeared simultaneously. So how do you know that internationalism?
No. So this is a good point, and let me give it an uncharitable rephrasing. Okay, that it doesn't really matter to your nation state. Actually, I'm going to be paraphrasing McNair, so it's not uncharitable. It's something he says elsewhere. It doesn't matter to the nation state if you're betraying them on behalf of the international working class or on behalf of one of their adversarial nation states. You behave like an antagonistic actor. You know, anti-revisionists often did this. They often behaved as an antagonistic actor within their state in a way that social democrats, but especially not Eurocommunists, did not. And this was even true to some extent to some revisionist, you know, quote, Khrushchevite, quote, communism before Eurocommunism.
Yeah, I think there's that trajectory that McNair paints of, like, basically going to socialism in one country and then kind of directing the official communist parties abroad to just sort of pursue a national politics and not make waves. And that drifts progressively more and more towards Eurocommunism, right? That because there is no international horizon, revolution seems, I don't know, the terms of revolution begin to drift. I think it's kind of the argument he's making there.
I feel like if he's kind of, like, if you're just looking at things like empirically, like, I forgot what the word was when, like, many things are correlated with each other. And it's like, okay, so, you know, like, what's causing what?
I know what you're saying. Yeah, you're saying, Pouya, that it's like the fall of the Soviet Union caused Eurocommunism, or was it the fall of the International that caused it?
Yeah,
you know,
you could just pick out any of these factors and say that, you know what I mean? And this was causing...
But I think that it's a kind of a dialectical thing where all of it is so interlinked I think they're all multi-causal. But like I think, look, I wrote some notes here at the bottom, and I was trying to figure out when I'm reading a book, sometimes I write notes and then I come back to it, I don't understand, and I finally understood what I was talking about here in this note there a minute ago. It's to do with like what we were talking about before about how the right always has this pressure on a left party to push to the right, to the centre or whatever. But it seems to be that if you have an actual functioning international, you have a counter pressure on the left parties that are part of that international to push them to the left. What do people like? Is that not a counteracting force that we can use?
I don't see how, like, you have a national communist politics and you end up anywhere other than the right position.
Right.
Correct.
If your orientation is national, how do you not end up repeating LaSalle in some way?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that's incorrect, but I'm saying like his like causal arguments, you know.
It's not as simple as he's saying here. I think that's definitely true.
That's true for the whole book.
Yeah, I don't think his causal arguments are very good. I think it would be better if he argued like, you know, internationalism is a correct position because X, Y, and Z or whatever, you know, like, you know, you need an international economy to be able to produce goods efficiently and, you know, whatever reasons he gives you. But yeah, his like causal arguments I don't think are correct usually. But they don't like ruin the book.
Well, I've been kind of engaging with this recently because, you know, he's kind of influenced by the analytical Marxists and has a lot of stylistic similarities. But like, you know, disagrees with the nominal analytical Marxists. He's polemicized, you know, against them recently even. I think the word you're thinking of before is overdetermination, when there's many causal factors. And am I right about that?
No, that's
No.
that's a word from Althusser.
There's a kind of standard Anglo philosophy of science definition, and then there's Althusser's spin on it.
I'm thinking about like the statistical word. Let me look it up.
Oh, okay.
I think
so. There's something more formal that you're thinking of.
Yeah, it's like multi-correlarity or something. I don't know.
Oh, okay. It's a general philosophy of science point. I think that there are multiple causes to these things, but a lot of Marxists have tried to just kind of not try to do causal analysis on these things and be correlative, and they kind of end up saying nothing.
Multiple correlation.
Yeah, multiple correlation. But I think like overdetermination is a different concept because overdetermination is saying like all these things like mutually determine each other. But I'm saying like he's looking at this like empirically. He's like saying, yeah, this like empirically happened and then that empirically or like these things empirically happened, right? You can't just like look at data and like, you know, it's not and just like come to your conclusions.
Right. It's a provisional hypothesis. If not, and your research should actually proceed assuming it's not true to try to disprove it to see its power.
But like these things are like all correlated. You know what I mean? All these things are like correlated together. So like, it's really hard to parse out what's doing what if you know all these things are happening together. If you're looking at a data and like a million different variables are correlated with each other, you know, like.
Yeah, this is a challenge of social scientific explanation or any, I mean, really a lot of kinds of scientific explanation.
I suppose what he is saying here, though, as well, is that he's putting forward the international, a causal reason for why when you get rid of what the power of an international is and when you take it away, what would it end up happening. So I suppose he's making an argument that this correlation is the one that matters. That's kind of what he's saying.
He says the word? He's imputing causal power to it, but I don't know if he's wrong. Like I think, like
what's he doing? I think is it called induction? Is he using induction right now?
Well, induction isn't necessarily like bad.
I don't know if you'd say it was induction.
Well, it's not a deductive proof. He is making like a claim that it was this factor that changed, this counterweight or something.
Let's not get too stuck up in it, will we? We kind of understand what we're saying.
I don't think I actually don't have a problem with a lot of his causal mechanisms are only, in my opinion, wrong by the omission of the social layer. There's a whole, like, broader kind of demographic, kind of like a labor movement thing going on underneath that needs to be kind of discussed in more detail to get a better causal explanation. But I don't have a problem with him looking for causal explanations in this manner.
Do you know what it reminds me of, Pouya? If you ever like listen to like a geneticist talking about mutations or evolution, and they'll say something like the anteater evolved a big nose so that it could stick its nose into stuff.
They'll say something,
right?
something super theological.
Absolutely.
It's a functional explanation.
But when they say it, they don't mean that that's what happened. They said, I need to get a new nose. It's a shorthand for talking about the randomness, and it's done all the time in science, you know what I mean? Where they'll actually, where like they'll say it in the kind of incorrect way because it's a shorthand to describe the right way. And I think that's how I read most of these things here as well.
It's like when Malthus created his argument, right? He was like looking at the population and the I forgot what the theory is actually called, but it's the one where the population grows faster than food. Like he was looking at data and he was like, oh look, like the population's like increasing and the food production and the population were like, he was looking at this data and they were like, it was doing what he was saying up and like while he was alive. And then like soon after, yeah.
Arguably, those trends only held before capitalism.
Yeah, it's extrapolating, a thing into the future. But yeah. Can we go on? We've only done a page and a half, and we're getting stuck into methodology here. I'm not trying to, but I do think the big point for me, like in this paragraph here, is that like the international can work as a counter to that force from the right. Do people think that's a true thing, Kyle?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that you're saying earlier that the right tries to pull the left to the center, but I don't think that's really quite true. Like, I think it's more the case that like the right pulls the center to the right, and they don't really care about the left very much because the left isn't going to block with them, right? What the international can do is create some sort of like provisional relationships between the center and the left, and it can help the center from actually just collapsing into the right, which is what happened like almost universally. Like there's very little parliamentary left politics that are not right in the world today.
Yeah, and I just want to add that, this is that what he was giving there isn't a functional explanation. It's an agency-based explanation. There's nothing to compel one to go left without the international.
Yeah, it's super important. Even if like it's only symbolic, it matters that there is some kind of symbolic unity that people actually care about, right? Like you can have like, all these Trotskyist internationals, it doesn't mean anything. But if there is this kind of like common symbolic project, it means something. Like I remember during Occupy, you had these like little tiny demonstrations of international working class unity, right? Like very small things, like people in Egypt, like during the Arab Spring, buying food for protesters out in Wisconsin, right? And like just seeing any kind of meaningful international working class unity was like kind of shocking because it's so off the horizon, and that and the degree to which like we are just trapped in the discourse of the right is really, really strong. Like yes, there has been a move towards socialist politics lately, but it is very much within the realm of right socialist politics.
Yeah. The symbol of unity in the Second International, the, classical workerist identity politic, is in a way like highly preferable to the Soviet Union litmus test that became the symbolic focus of the Third International and the sort of politics that came out of it.
Yeah, because for obvious reasons, that was a turnoff to many, many, many workers.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't be weighing in on which one was better or worse, but they're both kinds of, symbolic politics that don't work today, but they both point to the importance of symbolic unity and what it meant for those symbols to fall apart. It is hard to deal with in materialist terms, but I think it's true.
All right, here's what I'll do, right? Send me your addresses there in the chat, and I'll send you all a pizza. How about that?
I'm so inspired.
International.
I'm so inspired. I'm voting against war credits.
Woohoo! There we go. Let's push it to the right. Push it to the left, motherfuckers. Sorry. Yeah. Pizzas. Pizzas are the way forward.
Seriously, though, it is nice to have this international conversation about left politics, right? Like, we've got Americans, we've got Canadians, we got people for, like, we even have people in the chat, right? Like, it's nice to have because this thing doesn't happen very much.
Yeah, think of all the people in New York City that I'm not talking to, including Brooklyn, right now.
You should be out there giving out flyers, looking for that Patreon book out in Brooklyn right now. Giving out Swampside flyers. I should be hustling at the Verso Loft. Signing autographs, giving out posters, you name it. That's what you should be doing.
Yeah.
God damn it.
You want to buy my mixtape?
Well, here. So, like, this
you guys gotta buy my mixtape.
Hell yeah. I'll buy your mixtape, Pouya.
Thanks. Alright, we gotta move on.
Do you accept pizza? Okay, let's move on.
Yeah. Pouya's mixtape is like, this is a refrigerator, and this track here, this is a air conditioning unit, and this one over here, this track is a blender mixed in with a fridge and a microwave.
Pouya is trying to keep you on task, and you're mocking his creativity.
Sorry, it's getting late here. Okay. Let me read this one little sentence. I think it just kind of sums it up. Even in distorted forms, then, the struggle for international unity of the working class and the struggle for working class political independence stand and fall together. And I do go with that. I think that is true. Whether we'll have the statistical evidence for Pouya, we won't know. We'll only find out, Pouya, we'll only have the evidence after 100,000 failed revolutions, and we can get the stats ready for you.
I think it's a question of theory, kind of, because it's not really. I don't know how you would go about, like, you need like a good theory to be able to explain this stuff.
Yeah.
I just want to, like, underline how controversial this statement is, right? Like, to us, it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But, like, if I brought this to my local NDP branch, or, like, there isn't even a branch of the NDP because they don't give a shit about, having any, like, real membership. But, like, if I brought this to my local NDP MLA and I was like, okay, this has to be the foundation for our socialist politics, I would get laughed out of the room. Like, this is a really, really controversial point. It's not widely accepted at all. So it is worth talking about.
Very much so. Okay, now we're going to get on to this most. Honestly, it's something that the left never talks about: Russia. So let's go there.
Yeah,
we don't have enough Russia.
Russia's a country it's in Europe and Asia. Okay, I don't want to give too much background. Let's just go in there.
There's bound to be a good joke, like, along the lines of, do you know the one about what's the biggest city in the world? Do you know this joke?
Not sure.
Dublin, because its population keeps Dublin and Dublin.
Oh,
it's like there's got to be a similar crap joke about Russia. Yeah, I think there's like some inner rush. There's some rush joke that we could splice in there.
In which city? Which city do the trains run fastest in the world?
Moscow, because they're Russian. There you go.
Boom!
Also made it a little fascist too. Double boom.
I'm reading this one. Oh no, Kyle will read it. Kyle hasn't read yet today.
Kyle's got to read
it. Sure. The Russian question. If the policy of the Second International was fundamentally one of separate national revolutions, there was an undercurrent that suggested a repeat of 1848. This was expressed in Marx and Engels' responses to the Russian Narodnya Volya and became current among Russian Marxists. most explicitly in Trotsky's Results and Prospects, but also in Lenin's Two Tactics. The idea was that the fall of the Tsarist regime would rapidly trigger a European-wide workers' revolution and an 1848 on a higher level. This was the view held by Marx and Engels at the time of the Crimean War, and the correspondence with the Narodniks and Russian prefaces to the manifesto revived it. It was, in fact, a reasonable but mistaken response to the defeat of 1848. Russian intervention had played an important part in 1848 in defeats in Poland and Hungary, and the Tsarist regime was one of the principal guarantors of the European regime of the Congress of Vienna and the Holy Alliance that backed it. Knocking Russia out of the picture should therefore let loose the national democratic movements in Central Europe, Poland, Hungary, etc., and this would bring down the Austro-Hungarian and German regimes and trigger European-wide revolutionary aspirations in the style of 1848. It was a mistake because 1815 was fundamentally a British-sponsored settlement, placing a pressure lid on continental politics for the benefit of Britain. True, the Tsar, the King of Prussia, and the Emperor of Austria had provided most of the soldiers to defeat France, but the money that funded their armies had been raised and mobilized through London at the behest of the British government. The 1847 economic crisis led to the British-imposed lid being blown off all across Europe in a revolutionary explosion. The primary change that ensued, the regime of Louis Napoleon in France, freed French capital from the British-imposed chains of 1815 so that the French state could begin to compete on the military international level with Britain. As a result, in the ensuing period, Germany and Italy were driven towards unification in order to emulate France, and governments began to use or return to using war imperialism as a means to bleed off the internal contradictions of domestic politics and economics. Hence, after the Crimean War, the idea that the Tsarist regime in any strong sense guaranteed European political stability or was the policeman of Europe was illusory. In 1914 to 18, the point was emphatically demonstrated. Far from the Russian Revolution triggering the European Revolution, the European War triggered the Russian Revolution. The Central European national movements then proved to be a bulwark first of German, then of Entente policy against the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution did at one remove trigger revolutionary movements in Hungary, Germany, and Italy. Or it did so not by the route envisioned by Marx and Engels, that the removal of fear of Russian intervention in Central Europe would open the way to a revolutionary movement which would spill westwards. Nor did it do so by the route projected by Trotsky in Results and Prospects, that the Russian Revolution would spill over into Germany and or trigger a collapse of the London and Paris financial markets. Rather, the perception of the revolution as a workers' revolution triggered an international radicalization of the workers' movement. This radicalization reached its highest points in the countries which could not see themselves as victors in the war: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and, in a slightly different way, Italy. Advanced workers in these countries saw a possibility of workers' revolution as a result of 1917. They could see this possibility because of the prior symbolic international unity of the workers' movement in the form of the pre-war Second International.
When I interviewed McNair about this stuff, these few paragraphs here were very kind of hitting to me because, you know, this would lead us to think that the gambit of Lenin and the Bolsheviks in doing their revolution was a huge strategic misstep.
Yes.
This is pretty related to what Pouya was saying before about the difficulty of establishing causality. Critical theorists have a saying they like. It's the owl of Minerva flies at midnight. You don't necessarily see the important causal factors unless it's in retrospect. And you're dealing with a situation where not just, Trotsky and Lenin, and not just Marx and Engels, but really the entire revolutionary tradition from 1848 forward kind of had this view of Russia as the gendarme of Europe. and that there's always a temptation to, I'm not going to say do induction, because you got to do some induction, you have to do some analogies to the past, but to kind of overgeneralize, over-induce, like principles from the last experience as being like iron laws of your current experience. That's definitely what was at work from 1848.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like the positive legacy of 1848 was the realization of the importance of the social question and the importance of an international workers' movement. McNair acknowledges that the creation of the international and that sort of symbolic international workers' unity was a meaningful contributor to attempts at revolution at this time. The sort of negative side of it was that revolutionaries took the wrong lessons about the actual state of play of politics in Europe, apart from the sort of political versus social question problem, which obviously, was a major thing that sabotaged 1848 and also was learned from. People took kind of the right lesson from that, but the wrong lesson from what happened in terms of international power politics.
Yeah, and McNair laying it out like this, I mean, there's some people that are going to read this and, like, not get up for a couple days, just be like, whoa, I'm only familiar with the primary sources. I'm only familiar with what, the big beards had to say about these things. And even if you read around the revolutionary tradition more, and you're a primary source type, you're not going to find that many counter-arguments to this. This is just a different history than they expected and that they thought they were living in. The actors, necessarily have incomplete information. But yeah, that's what people were working with. It is tremendously sobering how wrong they got it. Even considering the fact that, we are talking about people that did act in ways, of course, that ended up that they couldn't possibly imagine. But they did act. And so you don't have to have like a perfect grasp of history in order to act.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this kind of comes out of that sort of like world system stuff, right? Like, I think that's where this kind of argument is coming from. Yeah. And just obviously that didn't exist at the time. And also I think for me, it's like, I usually look at Marx's biography and his like time spent as basically like a anti-Russian crank in the popular press, right? Like he's like one of the people who would be doing like the anti-Russia stuff today.
OG Russiagate.
Yeah, OG Russiagate was definitely Marx's job. And I usually just kind of look at that and sort of like laugh and I'm like, oh, well, everybody's got their stuff, right? But like, when you think about the degree of vitriol and hatred Marx had towards the Tsarist regime, and the way that actually kind of filtered down at the strategic level, it did actually have some harmful effects in meaningful ways, and not just this kind of like random crankery, like the sort of unpleasant side of Marx's biography, right? Like the like. This is stuff that like he was really off base in a lot of the stuff he said about Russia.
I mean, it's partially rooted in anti-Slavic racism.
yeah. Well, and just also 1848, right? Like there were real experiences of the sort of hopes and dreams of liberals and socialists being crushed at that time that leave some really deep scars. A lot deeper than Hillary Clinton not getting elected, Like it's... Yeah.
It was the Russians.
Yeah.
Kyle, watch your mouth. Watch your mouth.
I'm sorry.
I'm joking.
Please don't take me onto MSNBC. I'm sorry.
I don't know. You just laid out how we make $1 million right now.
Yeah, right. That's how we get our next textbook published, is we get our funding from anti-Russian crankery, just like Daddy Marx did. Oh boy.
Oh.
Seriously, you may be joking, but there's probably actually good money in that. What we should do is,
I'm going to bring back Cold War Marxism. Yeah.
what I'm going to have to do to you, Kyle, is I'm going to have to go like, what is it, Clockwork Orange on you, sit you down in front of Rachel Maddow and repeat for 12 hours.
No!
With your eyes, strap you down, keep your eyes open.
Tom,
Yeah.
I can't allow this to continue.
Okay, why don't I read this next bit? Because I really like this chapter. At first, October 1917 seemed to show that the working class could take power. This image promoted revolutionary attempts elsewhere, but the impulse rapidly ebbed. As disturbing news began to filter west, even Luxembourg in prison was hesitant. As the character of the Soviet regime was rendered more explicit in the theses of the 1920 and 21 Comintern Congresses, the ban on factions and the Kronstadt events, the majority of the existing militant left activists of the workers' movement in Western Europe took their distance from the Bolsheviks. This was reflected in the 1921 splits from the Comintern of both the larger part of those amongst the left of the Kautsky Centre who had flirted with it and the left communists, larger than they had later become. These splits foreshadowed the future. The nature of the Soviet regime was to become a primary obstacle to any attempt of the working class to take power in its own hands in Western Europe, and ultimately to international class political consciousness more generally. The image of an international chain of national revolutions, starting with Russia, was, nonetheless, to be the governing idea of Comintern international strategy, and after it, that of the Trotskyists. Well, God damn it. Like, there's a couple of paragraphs there. Right. What I really like reading this book is that he lays down, 5 or 6, well, no, not 5 or 6 is probably too many, but 3 or 4 massive strategic errors of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Just lays them plain. And what I find difficult as somebody who's not ever had drank the Lenin Kool-Aid is that how people can think the guy is such an amazing strategist when nearly every one of his key strategies were goddamn awful. Let me point some of them out. One of them was changing the vote on the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. So he went against what the actual vote should have been. That's supposed to be one that McNair says happened, right? Then you've got the idea that the Russian Revolution would spark off other revolutions. Wrong. Then you have Lenin was in power when the Comintern came up with their 21 or whatever they are theses, which split the parties all across Europe and weakened and put all these communist parties into sect mode for 100 years. Like, to me, they're just amazingly bad strategic choices, and I do not understand why people think Lenin was this head, this genius. I just find it baffling.
It's all tied up with what he's saying here, right? That the nature of the Soviet regime was to become a primary political obstacle to any attempt of the working class to take power into its own hands in Western Europe, and ultimately to international class political consciousness more generally. And I think the reason why people get so obsessed with Lenin is that he became a symbol of that international class political consciousness. And that was hugely destructive, but for the people who cling to Leninism, I think is very important, right?
Like, when I read this, okay, I'm coming from a, sort of, I guess, post-Leninist perspective, but when I read this stuff, it's hard to take a post-Leninist perspective. It makes you feel like the whole thing was a tremendous error. There's this old, quote by Max Weber, German sociologist. He was in, the SPD, big revisionist. I mean, I don't even know if that's the right term. Anyway, he says he's absolutely convinced these experiments in Russia can only have and will have the consequence of discrediting socialism for the next 100 years. Oof.
Oh.
I'm going to channel some Chomsky here. Chomsky said that the fall of the Soviet Union is the best thing to happen for socialism. And he's probably in the long term feckin' right.
I don't know. I mean, maybe in the long term, but in the short term, it was absolutely. But you know what? I guess if the Soviet Union was never a success, then its implosion wouldn't have been so traumatic. But it's just so hard to say. It's
Yeah,
a lot of people hear this stuff and just hear, oh, I mean, so just say, why try, fuck it, like, and it's no, you know, glory to the October Revolution and all that, but what happened from there? Like, where was the mistake? If October wasn't a mistake, and I'm not inclined to say it was, what's the error? What do you do in that scenario? Could it be that Lenin had a good strategy for staying in power, but a bad strategy for communism? Like,
yeah, definitely. And like, what's the story? Like, it's just a bad goddamn strategy, full stop. The left was in disarray in Central Europe. How are they all going to have successful revolutions when they're all in complete disarray? It's just a bad strategy.
Yeah. And so I try to talk to people that are relatively, well, excuse me. I've been, you know, sometimes people approach me for like advice, like kind of common sense, like Leninists, you know, that are just sort of open and are just sort of taking on the revolutionary tradition. And it's just so hard to tell them that just these casual resonances will just lead you astray. And it's not because you're not trying to be radical. It's really confusing because basically the people before us were incredibly confused and just doubled down on things that have caused us a lot of intellectual scrambling, has caused us just a lot of mental damage. And so much of it is the righteousness of the left and the importance of symbolic unity. I mean, they're correct, but like, you can't, I don't know. Scientific socialism is supposed to be something else. It can't just be like a religious fetish object that, you know, as like pixie dust, if you believe in it and clap your hands, like it'll work. Like, the Soviet Union did have a sway over people as a sort of like imaginative space of non-capitalism in the world, but what it really was in a way counterproductive for the global communist prospect.
Yeah, it's hard to look at like the gains that came out of October in the rest of the world and at the same time acknowledge how destructive the Soviet Union was for the international workers movement. Like, it's so hard to hold those two things in your mind at once.
I mean, they might as well be like a parallel universe. It's so bizarre. But, you know, eventually it you know, the Soviet Union exports the brain worms, you know? Like, it doesn't take that long.
Yeah, well, and this catastrophic falling out that he describes that happens as soon as people, like, you know, as soon as workers start to learn what's actually happening in the USSR is really, really damaging. Like, just enormously damaging. And then, you know, what do you get later down the line, right? You get like new left stuff, which is very much confused by all of this.
Yeah, it still takes on this sort of like weak chain thing as an extrapolation from the Russian experience and the Chinese experience, which, you know, very different experiences. But they were looking for that causal factor in a way that, you know, is conducive to acting, you know? And yeah, makes one pretty dizzy how wrong people got it. But again, these are the actors. These are the people doing shit. There were people that were correct, but they were like throwing tomatoes on the sidelines and no one took them seriously.
Or they just like went full on reactionary, right?
Right. Yeah, they lost their fucking minds. Or they just, not even lost their minds. They assumed that their convictions were like incompatible with humanity because of how distorted it got.
Or that they could somehow change American power to be something like what they wanted out of socialism, right? Yeah. Like there were like deals struck and compromises made that led to sort of like what we got out of Cold War American ideology. Yeah.
Well, look.
What do you mean, like New Deal?
Great Society.
Yeah. Great Society is more it. Like post-war American internationalism, modernism, American modernism.
Oh, like the Marshall Plan and the UN.
Yeah, the UN. Yeah, there are a lot of ways in which like socialists sort of made their peace with that, and it did influence the character of what ended up happening in America in the Cold War, but certainly it was a deeply compromised and damaging arrangement in the long run. In a similar way to, like, you know, you look at what was positive about the Russian Revolution abroad and how that all ended up kind of going in a bad direction too. It's like, it's so fucked up. I mean, the 20th century was a disaster, right? Like, it's...
Oh, one after another.
I mean, the Soviet Union internally, I mean, it was pretty, like, they developed their industry pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, it
was a progressive in a lot of ways.
You got right socialism out of the Soviet Union, right? Like, it was a distorted kind of right socialism.
I mean, it's not socialism the way Marxists talk about it, but it is what people think of as socialism now, and what some people thought of as socialism before. Like, so I guess it's kind of socialism.
No, it's not. People think socialism is Sweden, and they think communism is Russia.
Well,
Right.
You got to go to socialism before you go to communism. I mean, I think that whole debate is so fun. It's so fun because all the terms have been emptied of content.
Right.
That, like, you can just have an entire conversation with people. I think Tom has said this before. You're using all the same words, and they're just floating signifiers. They don't fucking mean to you what they mean to the other person.
All of this stuff is why I put all my hope into North Korea. Now,
the Juche idea will surely get us out of this postmodern malaise.
And Comrade Bernie. Comrade Bernie and the Juche idea.
Yeah.
Why not? Why not? We threw in our lot behind the Soviet Union and Lenin for so long. What's wrong with Kim Il-jung?
That's not a joke. That's really not a joke. That's the way a lot of people think. That's, even to an extent where people are doing like solidarity, and kind of just the urge to displace your political consciousness somewhere that's more important. You know what I mean? Like, it's hard to overstate that.
So, like, I have a couple things to say. The first thing is, like, on North Korea, when I lived in Japan, I feel like I was a lot softer on North Korea just because I was scared they were going to shoot missiles at us. Like, being that proximity to North Korea is like, well, maybe we can work something out. Maybe it'll get better eventually. Maybe it's not so horrible. There was a lot of sort of like self-deception I did in terms of just like, just not wanting a war, I feel like that's not really an excuse for a lot of people abroad who find ways to convince themselves that North Korea is a great place. But, you get a lot of really strange ideologies. Like, I don't think I ever talked about this before, but I knew this guy in university who was a Maoist and was convinced that Mao was actually a reincarnation of the Buddha, who was a space alien who had come to Earth to spread, enlightenment to everybody. Like, this is the kind of, like, I do not consider that to be significantly more just like brain rot than the people who are like North Korea is the vanguard of international revolution. Like, those are both just really bizarre perspectives.
See, I could go with that. I could definitely go with Mao Space Alien. I think that's pretty fucking good. In California, go to LA. You could set up a fucking cult there. You could do well on that.
Well, I mean, if you're in California, you really see the pipeline from the new left to the new age. There's so much similarity, and it's devastating. Once you see it, you can't unsee it.
It's a right-wing phenomenon.
Like,
new age stuff.
Right, but
new
then,
left.
Well, then you think about, the new left, like, prefigures this, and the new age, in a way, is like a way of subsuming those, like, revolutionary political horizons to more revolutionary ontological horizons, And they're both ways of dealing with, like, alienated senses of agency and power and desires for change, just alienated at different levels. And, I mean, at least crystals and incense and, like, Mao's a space alien, if you buy their ontology, they have a more plausible causal mechanism there. If you're committed to materialism, like, you can't do that anymore. Like,
well, and I just think about, like, the number of New Left people I've known, or people who are students of New Left people who were just, like, super into Heidegger.
Yeah.
And, like, a lot of that happened in the dissident movement in the Eastern Bloc too. Like, there was So much of that just like movement to the new age. Like, what was it, Václav Havel? Like, he was a big new age guy.
On the day he came over to, I think, the American Senate or the Congress, and they gave him some like medal of freedom, and he gave this big speech, and it was really important. The very day, I think, and he talked about how the US was a beacon for freedom and all this stuff. I think that the exact day the US had like gone into Honduras or Nicaragua and killed like 5,000 people. That's like, I remember Chomsky saying it, like it was literally at the exact day, and he stood up there and do it. So that'll tell you all you need to know about these goddamn anti-communist heroes, communist anti-communists. Now here.
But, I feel like this is also of a piece with the thing that McNair was talking about the Euro-communists becoming more liberal than the liberals.
Yeah.
Right. It's the same sort of degeneration.
Yeah, like CPUSA wouldn't endorse Bernie in 2016 because Bernie wasn't a realistic candidate.
Yeah, and the Blairites came out of that. Look what happened to the PCI. Like it's just wild. Like that is another like enormous mindfuck. Like that whole degeneration there.
Lexi, will you read this section, Comintern and the Trotskyites?
I sure will.
Trotskyists. The Trotskyists.
You mispronounced
Trotskyites. That's nearly better.
Trotskyites is almost uniformly said in between Wrecker and between three sets of parentheses. The idea that became the Communist International began, as we have already seen in Chapter 4, with the anti-war wing of the Second International, and with Lenin and Zinoviev's struggle within this left for an international split. Comintern was able to emerge because of the Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917, and the survival of the revolutionary regime into 1919, when the first Congress of Comintern met. The result was that Comintern had a double character. On the one hand, it was an international of the anti-war left, attempting to redeem the honor of socialism after the ignominious political collapse of the Second International. On the other hand, it was a fan club for the Russian Revolution and its leaders. The fan club aspect became more prominent with the defeat of the Hungarian and, especially, the German and Italian revolutionary movements. On the one hand, the Russians had the prestige of victory and the material resources of state power. On the other, the Germans had lost some of their most eminent leaders, and the Westerners in general had failed where the Russians had succeeded. It was natural for Comintern, in these circumstances, to become a body that propagated the idea of the Russian Revolution as a universal model. In international strategy, this had two aspects. The first was that defense of the Soviet regime was the central touchstone of the Communist Party's internationalism, the idea that it might be appropriate to admit the defeat of a proletarian socialist policy in the face of the defeat of the Western revolutionary movements of 1919 through 20 and of peasant resistance in Russia, and carry out a controlled retreat to capitalism was literally unthinkable to Comintern. Whether such a retreat was a possible option is doubtful, but the inability of the communist parties to think it probably contributed to the fact that the degeneration of the Soviet regime into open tyranny brought the communist parties down with it. It also produced among the Trotskyists a bizarre body of competing theological dogmas about the Stalinist regime that provided ideology for the Trotskyists' endless splits. This is among some of the most devastating paragraphs in the book.
Hit it, Lexi. Hit it.
The idea that it might be appropriate to admit the defeat of a proletarian socialist policy in the face of the defeat of Western revolutionary movements and peasant resistance, and carried out a controlled retreat to capitalism, was literally unthinkable to Comintern. And then he said, well, maybe this was not possible, this is doubtful, but historical materialistly, if that's a word, that's just unquestionably true. Like,
true.
Well, in terms of Marx's old theory of historical materialism, right? Kind of got to have the capitalist productive forces for communism to even be on the agenda. And so if you don't have that stuff yet, there's two ways to get them. Oh, you overthrow capitalism in a block with more developed capitalist countries, and you can peacefully, import them at your own pace, or, whatever.
You can piggyback on their productivity or whatever.
You can piggyback on the capitalist productive forces, the developed capitalist productive forces of other powers. The other option you have, traditionally in socialist theory, before this really became a thing, was you're fucked and isolated. And Marx and Engels essentially warned about this, and McNair discusses this in other parts of the book when he talks about what would happen to an isolated regime from that point forward. Historical materialistly, you're supposed to have that stuff. The actual situation of the Leninists created basically an ideological pressure for a second option. This ended up being expressed in, someone who understood historical materialism fairly well. It was Nikolai Bukharin. He ended up writing the basis for socialism in one country. Originally, this was sort of supposed to be, in a way, a drawdown from the kind of revolutionary intensity that animated the whole Bolshevik project. And Bukharin was no slouch. He was pushing for, if I recall correctly, Bukharin wasn't initially for the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. He knew damn well that without the rapid expansion of the revolution and the seizure of big capitalist productive forces, the revolution was fucking doomed. He knew full well that. So when he was pursuing this, research avenue, there's a whiff of desperation about. And this ends up being subsumed into a less, in terms of the Comintern, it's less right-wing in the sense that they don't want to just draw down into markets. No, they wanted to pursue a centrist option. And so Stalin capitalizes on this desire to continue the revolution within this country, comrade. We can't admit the defeat of the revolution, but yet we are in one country. That's the basic bounded choice model that leads you to Stalinist cultistry. It's, it's bound up in the isolation without capitalist productive forces. It's hard to explain, not all the political errors that come out of this, because there's some unforced errors, there really are. But, that's the basic choice model you get.
So, if there were Western revolutions, they couldn't probably plan the economy at this point in time. So...
That's an additional complication that kind of invalidates the whole idea of a proletarian revolution at that point.
Yeah, they probably... So, what do you think would have happened? They probably would have done, a NEP type thing, a more efficient...
Best case scenario, they avoid World War I and develop cybernetics early. That would be it.
I think in the short term they would have gone towards market socialism, because that was a fairly influential ideology at that time.
And honestly, there was some legitimacy to that being the historical materialistly best way of doing it. There was no at that time better technology for dealing with a complex economy distributionally. There just wasn't. That didn't exist yet.
Well, the economy wasn't that complex in 1914. They didn't have 1 billion products or 500 million that we have now. They probably only had 10,000 probably core ones that could probably be planned by councils.
But if there was any remaining capitalism in the world, that capitalism would have developed, at some point, would have entered that market, the later stages of capitalism that we know to some degree, where that aspect of consumer choice becomes attractive and becomes a hallmark of freedom. And probably in our communist bloc, we would have had the same kind of Khrushchevite envy, of capitalist success.
But what I'm trying to say is that, perhaps, let's say you got an amazing situation. The German Revolution succeeded, and the Russians went with it, and the Italians went, and the Spanish, and the British, and everybody had a revolution, and you had a big, massive Eurasian bloc, and they each did like national planning, say, and there was some internationalism with it, and they developed computers. And then by the 50s or 60s, there was no World War II. Obviously, there would be some fucking war. Somebody going to fight them.
Would have been a class war. We won the class war. Yay.
Planning in Russia worked reasonably well up until the 50s or 60s, didn't it?
Well,
Yeah, it did.
Well,
In
like
some things, yeah.
It had a
like-
higher rate of growth. I mean,
Yeah, but like,
Yeah.
oh, what a cost.
yeah, it had an
Like-
extremely high rate of growth.
yeah, an extremely like the human cost was greater than virtually anything else you can imagine.
I cannot imagine that if the Western Revolution succeed, you get like, Stalinist forced, like, quote unquote primitive socialist accumulation, right? Like
It was literally unthinkable to Kautsky that would be the case.
so I guess I should revise what I said. Like, yes, market socialism was quite influential at the time, but when you think back to it, Otto Neurath was trying to create a non-market planned economy in Bavaria at this time. The prestige of the German planned economy during the war was very high. There certainly were forces that also could have tipped it towards a non-market outcome in Europe as a whole. Because, yeah, it might have even helped that they weren't doing just horrible corvée conscription of people at an enormous human cost, right?
Is McNair's argument that the political forces would be different if there was revolutions in the West, and that's what would lead to a success of the World Revolution?
Yeah, this is to a great degree about like the reason that the Third International was able to be a Russian fan club. If there were other competing models for success, or
if it had just been multipolar, right?
Yeah, they would have made the same fetish error of doing, these are the right revolutionary policies for your country because these are the only ones that worked before. It would have been like 2 or 3 different fan clubs in the same house.
Yeah, which is like going back to the sort of earlier historical discussion about class dictatorships. That's kind of like the model that McNair envisions, right? That like you have competing tendencies within the class dictatorship. It becomes a class regime, but it does not become one without differing views of what happens. We can see like today how the technology we have really like makes non-market planned economies much more viable, but I wouldn't want to write off entirely the possibility that the entire ingenuity of the Russian, of the Soviet Union and the rest of Western Europe couldn't have, in a more sort of free and open society, come up with a better solution. It's impossible to say.
Yeah, and also, political factors are kind of important. And also, you have better access to raw materials in different areas in the world. And so, that increases your efficiency. So that probably would also help.
You don't get all the German scientists going to the USA,
That's it. And Ireland has all the potatoes. You boys better be nice to us. There are no chips for you guys, no fries. If you're not nice to the patties.
Yeah,
and also they could probably afford that really high rate of growth, considering that if the means of production in the West are a lot better, you can afford putting more aside for growth if your output is very high, like a more absolute quantity.
Yeah, planning did work, reasonably well at high cost, of course, for a bunch of like the essentials. It wasn't until later on, really, like after World War II, that honestly, there was all kinds of terrible things happening inside the USSR, and they were like, because of how concentrated it was, the errors that they made were some of the most catastrophic in history because it was so concentrated. Like, and it's hard to overstate that. The point is that, like, if there was other revolutions, it would have affected the consciousness of the Third International. It would, like, the Bolsheviks would have had to compete maybe with, other tendencies that were corrupt in different ways. maybe in tendencies that were corrupt in the same way. I guess it could have led to the same thing. But it probably, wouldn't be the kind of stuff we're dealing with right now, where people have, like, this single revolutionary vision.
I have a hard time imagining that, like, a third international that includes people like the Austro-Marxists would have gone the same direction.
Yeah.
Like, there's just really different point of view. You have people in Europe at that time who had sort of different ideas of how planning might be arranged and were more sort of conscious of, like, the epistemological and methodological problems that you would run into. That could have made a positive contribution if it hadn't been, like, this kind of society where if you're an intelligent, free-thinking person, you're likely going to be shot.
To this day, the culture of the left still bears this impact, and you might say the incentives are there beforehand, but this does provide just a powerful ideology for doing it. I mean, I was kicked out of a, like, pluralist McNairist project, quote pluralist, like, during the recording of this series. I helped start Cosmonaut magazine with Donald Parkinson, right? And it was more or less, like, acceptable that we had some sort of, there was something that went on. There was clearly some personal elements to it. I don't understand it entirely, so I couldn't communicate. But the political norms were there where it could be framed as cutting out, like, a wrecker for disagreement. Not for sabotage, but for having a similar framework and disagreeing on some points. That was, like, pretty acceptable. Most of the people that are participating in that, I mean, they didn't, like, disassociate from that. They didn't go, oh shit, that's, wow, that's bad. We gotta get out of here. No, it's sort of an accepted part of left political culture. This happened while I was recording this.
Yeah. Oh, it's heavy.
I designed their website, by the way.
It's a cool website.
Thanks. Yeah, I did it for free.
Yeah.
On this episode, you heard the theme tune, The Order of the Pharaonic Jesters, and Night of the Purple Moon by Sun Ra and his orchestra. Thank you for listening, and please join me for the next episode of From Alpha to Omega. This show is a member of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast and research collective. Make sure to check out our network sister podcasts, General Intellect Unit and Swampside Chats.